What the fuck is up, y'all buttercups? Let's get this shit. Alright, so I had explained, or had mentioned, that at 250 subs, I would do a settings breakdown video. And this is essentially that. So I'm gonna go over what each setting kind of means, how you can kind of adjust it so that you can get better yourself, and making your own suspension and advanced settings. So the first thing we're gonna go over is suspension. We've got your high and your low speed compression and rebounds. Now these all are essentially functioning off the same thing. So first off, for your compression dampening settings, the higher the compression dampening number, the more it's going to resist like compressing. And with your high and low speeds, your high speed is going to be kind of what like is its limiter essentially. So like when you case, when you overjump, when you hit a braking bump really hard, it's going to go off of your high speed. So you're going to typically want this number high. Your low speed, on the other hand, is going to be kind of how linearly it affects it. So if you have it around 50, it's pretty linear. Which means the suspension acts in a straight-ish motion. It doesn't have any extra load on the front and release on the rear, or vice versa. Um, Typically on freestyle setups, you'll run it higher. Same with Supercross, you'll run it somewhere, I call somewhere in the 60s to 70s, maybe even high 50s, just to kind of give it that extra oomph on the top end. The rebound settings is the same thing. The higher the number is, the less it can kind of expand fast, like the more it dampens the rebound. So freestyle settings, you'll have it quite high. Same with Supercross. Outdoors, you'll have these probably more plush, more softer numbers. Your preload, now these are interesting things to kind of take care of. The preload is important to note that when you're looking at Supercross and outdoors, you don't typically change your preload that much, I'd say. You want to run them relatively low. Like so on a Supercross setup, you'd see a preloads of, like a 35 and a 42 to a 45 range, maybe even up to like 48. It depends on how you want the bike to kind of sit. And that's what this judges. This sets how your bike ends up leveling off with all the weight on it. So you want it to be a bit soft so that it's not super stiff the whole way through, and these get stiff very fast. I have the rule of thumb of you can change everything by 5 except your spring rates and your preloads. You can go up or down by 5 at a time and test, and I normally only change one setting at a time unless you're building a setup from scratch. But your spring rates and your preloads, you'll change only a max of 3. So you'll go 3 up or 3 down when you change, and your spring rate, I should go over real quick as well, is it determines the higher the spring rate, the more it compresses, but the more it rebounds. So if you run a high spring rate, you have to counter its rebound more frequently, but it'll do a lot of the compression work for you. As you see, I have relatively high spring rates, more or less so in the shock. It's quite high. 70 is not what you'd run racing in most setups unless you have a soft preload or soft settings. But yeah, so your preloads and your spring rates, you don't want to change those drastically. Your fork oil level kind of determines how stiff your forks end up being. Like, imagine 0 is air forks and 100 is oil forks, in a sense. Like 0 super plush, pushes through super easy. You wouldn't really ever run 0. You might run like as low as 30, but you wouldn't run 0. Whereas if you run it at 100, it's like filled with oil. It's got a lot of viscous stuff to try to push through. It's immediately stiffer. And it kind of is like your it's kind of like your regulator for your forks. So if you think your settings feel good, but it's not quite stiff enough, you can turn up your oil level. Or if it feels too stiff, but like the settings feel good, you can turn down your oil level in a sense. In a way, it kind of regulates that, but it does loosen up uh, the bottom end of like the compression. Sprockets. Now these are relatively easy to deal with. You're gonna come stock with 0, 0. Um, 0, 0 is just, it as a baseline from going backwards from 0 on countershaft, i.e. your front sprocket, would create acceleration, take away top speed. Adding teeth to the front or adding numbers to the front sprocket will increase top speed, reduce acceleration, and it's the opposite for the rear sprocket. So if you add teeth, you're actually adding um, acceleration and decreasing top speed, and if you're taking it away, you're adding top speed. You know, that type of thing. An important thing to note is that when you change your front sprocket, it actually has a much bigger impact because there's less teeth. Um, and for outdoors, like on a 450, you won't really run much worse than like a 0, 1 or a 0, 2, as like that's relatively long for a 450. Unless you hate shifting. Um, So typically you'll see your countershaft being a -1 on a 450, your rear sprocket could be almost anything from that point onward, or if you see it -2, it's going to be on the lower end, typically. I actually run -2, -1, or -2, 0, I think for freestyle. Messed up my own settings. But then we go on to the rider verticals and forwards. So the vertical and forward springs, both of these are essentially same thing, different direction. So if you think about the forward spring, it's easier to think of the vertical spring. The forward spring is how much you go forward and back. How much you lean forward, how much you can lean back, like your actual range you got. So it's the same thing for your vertical, how high you can stand and how much you fully squat without sitting. Now, the dampening is the most important bit here in a sense, where it's like if you run a high dampening, if you run a high range but a lot of dampening in your verticals, that means you have like a lot of leg strength and essentially, and if you run forward dampening, you have a lot of arm strength. You can't necessarily pop as fast with forward, so I tend to run my forward dampenings lower. Um, but you want to run high vertical dampenings for hard landings, for braking bumps, for all these types of things. Now, the most controversial thing I'm going to bring up is mass distribution because a lot of people don't get how mass distribution works. They think it's how far you can like lean forward, back type thing, which is not. That's your forwards. Um, Mass distribution is kind of where, like, how much of the center of mass on the rider's body. So if you run it all the way down at 0.33, the lowest it goes, that means that your dude has thunder thighs, big calves, and he forgets to train his arms some days. Uh, he's built from the hips down like a pole dancer type thing. So that's really good for outdoors, like great for outdoors. Keeps you relatively planted. Your turnings are kind of snappy up top. You can just like plant into ruts. However, not good for being real quick in turning, and like you can't turn real quick with that because of how the mass is. So for freestyle, I tend to run it all the way cranked up. Now this is being built like Weston Pike. You got a giant fucking chest. You got the legs to match, but like most of your weight centered around like your belly button. Like you're a big fucking dude with this. So in realistic senses, running it like you'd run anywhere between like 0.39, 0.46 for like that this range is like outdoors. You'd say like sand track, you'd say like hard pack type thing, and then you go up here, you'd be like, okay, you got like supercross is at this range, and freestyles just crank it out, and there you go. Now for actual like freestyle settings, I'll kind of I'll have my setup that was relatively built, and you gotta be careful with how you have your freestyle setup because you need enough traction to stick to the lips and get your pop off of them, but you also have to have it stiff enough to where it takes hard impact. Now advanced. This might have to do some visual demonstrations for you guys, but you know, leveling is essentially a very good way to just kind of like how much work do you want to do. So if you had like a leveling of 30, it balances you back quickly on its own as you turn. Like it stands you back up. Your leveling helps stand you back up from turning. Like I don't have to do anything for it to stand me back up turning there. However, if I drop it right back down to my 22 and I lean it over, it takes longer for it to start standing me back up. Essentially, how much work do you want to do? Now, it does affect you harder as like your front end compresses and you enter a corner. That is a part of like being stable. So your roll dampening is this thing that determines how much you can actually like how much you fall over as you say set up for a turn or generally are riding. Like having a higher roll dampening resists falling over. It'll keep you upright. Your angle is kind of like your catching zone. It's kind of the area that it catches you. Now, the factor determines how much it catches you in like this exponential way. So 5, it barely catches you. But if you say you ran it at like 12, 13, it really wants to like hold you kind of at that range in a sense. Now, your steering dampening is like your bar stability. So like, imagine if you had it all the way at 0, your bars are completely dangled. There's almost no friction in your bars. You have the best bearings on the planet. You turn it up to 100, you have an FMX stabilizer cranked all the way up. Like, you're just not turning those bars, even if you, like, leaned against them with your whole body. It's just not happening. So you want to run... I think it's important on how you ride to determine how you set this up, but I have a rule of thumb for my riding style and for freestyle that I'll run my steering dampening higher than my roll dampening because it creates kind of this effect where you can lean before the bars fully kick in and you can create really nice sideways pops. It's kind of a little feature of like, it's as if you have a bit of a freestyle stabilizer on your bike. So if you ran your roll dampening and your steering dampening roughly the same, it feels in a linear fashion when you change it. Um, However, you do sometimes need your bar stiffer than your rolling. Sometimes if you're not prepared to like lean all the way, you want to do more work with your steering. You want to, you know, have a less steering dampening than roll dampening in a sense, so you don't fall over as you turn so hard. All these types of things. The steering strength is like the strength of the rider, along with the max steering force, like how much strength you got to turn. So if you turn your strength all the way up, you're turning as strong as you can. And the force is how much force that strength really is. I'm not 100% certain on the combo there, but you know, they exist. JLV could, you know, always chime in, it'd be lovely. Direct steering, I've always ran this at 1. It just makes sense. I don't know. Don't know, don't care. Leave it at 1. That's my opinion. I genuinely don't really know a whole lot about the bottom settings, to be honest. I know your landing dampening stuff affects how much you absorb the landing, and like the ramp up and fall off is kind of like your immediate strength versus how much you let off. So I've always run like this type of stuff. I don't really know. It just it works. Hopefully I could have been of some help to you guys and maybe got some explanations in a bit better. Another thing I probably forgot to mention, don't grab the front brake. The front brake is your enemy, rear brake is your friend. If you don't have split brakes, freestyle is going to be hard. Remember that key note. I do want to say thank you guys so much for 250 subs. Like, that feels good with all the effort I've been throwing into the YouTubes because I feel like I'm a pretty decent sim player and It's really nice seeing you guys show up and interact, and I've I've been enjoying it. I've been actually quite glued to my phone trying to respond to all the comments I've been getting, which is nice, and seeing the likes come in is also really nice. It's validating. You know what? That's the word, validating. And I'm just glad to see it, and I hope to see we climb maybe as high as we can get it. Peace.